So today we're going to go over some of the basic principles behind cardiac MRI imaging. So I think all of you are aware, here's an example of an MRI scanner. This is actually the one that we used to have in Main 2. So the advantages, MRI gives you the ability to have a non-invasive assessment of the heart, no ionizing radiation, but it uses high magnetic fields. And what we're going to do for today's lecture is go into a little bit of the different components of the MRI scanner itself. Now I think most of you are probably familiar with what it's able to produce, which is really these various sets of images. And one of the, I think, strengths of MRI is the versatility in the sense that you can use it for things like tissue characterization when you're trying to identify a cardiac mass, use it for things like myocardial viability assessment, again, where you're doing tissue characterization with gadolinium contrast. But it's also good for anatomic assessment, like we do for pericardial diseases, aortic diseases. But we can also do flow assessment and use that information to determine severity of valvular lesions. MRI can also be coupled with a stress technique, either dobutamine or vasodilator stress. Can you hear me okay? No. To be able to look at myocardial perfusion. So, obviously you can do many different things, but let's kind of go back to the basics and really talk about how MRI got its start. So really it was these two men right here, Paul Lauterberg and Peter Mansfield, both PhD scientists, that did the initial work for developing MRI techniques for imaging of humans. And in fact, what they did was they imaged a finger in a human patient. It took them 5 hours, so it's quite a long acquisition time. But they received the Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine for their discoveries concerning magnetic resonance imaging. So most of the work they did was really in the late 60s and 70s, but you can see the Nobel Prize tends to lag behind, so it takes quite a bit of time. So again, for all of you that are doing research now, you never know. One of your work could eventually become a Nobel Prize, but you have to wait quite a while before you get it. So actually I kind of gave away the answer here, which is when was the first human MRI experiment done, and it was in the 1970s, in fact 1977. So again, this is a technology that we're in the first half a century from development in first human application to where we are today. Now here's a question, let me poll the audience here. For MRI imaging in humans that we do clinically today, what's the most important element? Is it oxygen? Is it hydrogen? Or is it carbon? Can I get, raise your hand if you think it's oxygen. Okay, nobody. Raise your hand if you think it's hydrogen. Okay, we got about 80% of the people. Raise your hand if you think it's carbon. Nobody. Okay, so everybody's right. There's a few that are abstaining. In fact, it is hydrogen. Now you can do MR with a variety of different elements. But hydrogen is the one that we use clinically today. And so we call it proton-based imaging. And the reason for that is because the human body is composed of almost 2/3 water, and water is hydrogen. Water is hydrogen atoms. So as a result, that's what gives you the best signal. But you can do imaging with carbon, you can do imaging with sodium, with phosphorus, with a variety of different elements. Or I shouldn't say imaging, you can do MR with those different elements. And so the basic principles for clinical MRI imaging is two things. Obviously, we're dealing with a human tissue which has a high amount of hydrogen protons. We apply a strong magnetic field which causes an alteration in the magnetic field within the subjects that we're imaging. And then there's also radio frequency waves that are being transmitted in and being received back. And it's really these two basic things, magnets and radio waves, that allow you to generate then MRI images. But obviously there's many more steps that are involved in that. And so what we're going to do is go through a little bit about some of the basic physics behind MR imaging. I'm also going to talk about MR safety, talk a little bit about implanted devices, and then talk about gadolinium-based contrast agents as well, because these are some of the things that I think are important for us to know when we're thinking about utilizing MR in our clinical patients. So here really is a breakdown of kind of the three main components of any clinical MR system. And so it involves the main magnet, which is what you're seeing over here. And this really specifies what the strength of your magnetic field is, what the strength of your scanner is. And then in addition to that, you also have, and this is a static magnetic field that it creates. There's also gradient coils, which allow you to create alterations in the magnetic field. And then we have radio frequency coils, which allow you to transmit and receive radio frequency signals. Yeah, unfortunately, it's either an all or none phenomenon for the front here. Yep. Okay, so let's go through some of these one by one. And so the first question is, what are the typical field strengths that we use in clinical MR today? And the choices are 1.5 Tesla, 3 Tesla, 0.5 Tesla. These are the ones that we use today, okay? So most of what's done is 1.5 or 3. There are now low field strength scanners, 0.5 Tesla. You can certainly do non-cardiac imaging. There is some sites that are doing work to do cardiac imaging on these low field strength 0.5 Tesla scanners. But the reality is MRI scanners really stretch the spectrum as far as field strength. So there's a 7 Tesla scanner, and this actually is one we have clinically available here in our research institute. This is actually that scanner that when it was going in a few years ago. And then there's smaller scanners that are 9 and even 11 Tesla, but most of those tend to be a much smaller bore, so they're really for small animal imaging. And the reason for that is one of the challenges as you go to a higher field strength, you're more likely to have inconsistency or what we call inhomogeneity in the magnetic field, which makes it more challenging to image, especially if you have a wide area. So that's why at the higher field strengths, you generally need to have smaller and smaller bore, which is basically the size of what you put your subject within. Okay, so I talked a little bit about the main magnetic field. So this is constant, and this is oftentimes referred to as B naught. And again, the clinical scanners that we have mainly are going to be 1.5 and 3 Tesla. And to just give you an idea of what is 1 Tesla, 1 Tesla represents about 20,000 times the Earth's magnetic field. I think we're all aware, if you ever have a compass, you know that the Earth has a certain magnetic field. And so a Tesla is 20,000 times what the magnetic field of the Earth is. Now, so in addition to the main magnet coils, there's also these things called gradient coils. And these gradient coils are actually also, you know, most people when they think of when you lay down on a scanner, what you're laying down on is what's called the bore. That's the open area. But then there's this circular tube that's around it, and the gradient coils are embedded within that circular tube. So you have the main magnetic coils within that circular tube, and inside of that there's also gradient coils. And the purpose of these gradient coils, which are present in all 3 axes, so they're present in the X, Y, and Z coordinates. And the purpose of the gradient coils is to cause a slight alteration to the magnetic field locally. And it's called a gradient because it will cause an alteration that varies based on what location you are, what location you're at. And so, for example, if a gradient is applied in the head to foot direction, what it will do then is it will cause the magnetization, let's say, to go from 1.5 Tesla, which is what the native magnetization was, to a little bit less than that in one direction and a little bit more than that in the opposite direction. And it's called a gradient because it varies. The further away you get from the center, the more either positive or more negative the alteration in the magnetic field is. And so there's actually kind of specific parameters that we utilize to define what the strength of the magnetic field or the strength of the gradient is. And that's basically the steepness of the slope. So how steep or how much of a variance in the magnetization can you achieve based on how far you are from the center point. And then there's also another parameter which is called the slew rate, which is how fast can you achieve that gradient. And so that's really defined as in millitesla per meter per, in millitesla per meter per second. And so that defines the speed at which you can achieve that gradient. So those are kind of the basic parameters that you look for to say, okay, what's the strength of my scanner, and what are the parameters of the scanner? One of the things, obviously, for cardiac imaging, since you need to image very fast, remember that first example I showed you where they imaged a finger, it took 5 minutes to generate that finger image. You don't have that kind of luxury when we're talking about cardiac imaging. So you have to be able to image fast, and so as a result, you need scanners that have very high speed. That's one of the crucial requirements, is the speed of the scanner gradient coils. That determines how long it takes to do your acquisition, and that determines then how long your breath hold time is going to be. Because ultimately, when we do cardiac imaging, we try to have the patient hold their breath during the time when we do our acquisition. The other thing to keep in mind is, since you have these three gradients, you can actually create a coordinate system, and that's what happens when a patient goes into the MRI scanner and when you do clinical imaging, is there's actually a gradient coordinate system, and we really refer to this as the head to foot direction, or the z-axis, and then there's also an x and y axis, which again is anterior to posterior and left to right. And there's gradients that are sitting in those directions, but the reality is you can play a combination of gradients so that you're not limited to just these three anatomic planes. You can pick any imaging plane that you want by playing a combination of any two gradients that create a vector that can be off in a different direction. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the made magnet coil, which again is 1.5 or 3 Tesla for most clinical imaging, but can be as low as 0.5 Tesla and can be as high as 9 or even 11 Tesla. We talked about the gradient coils, which cause a slight alteration in that magnetic field. And then the third component of it, from a hardware standpoint, is the radio frequency coils. And there's really two sets of radio frequency coils. There's the transmitter coils. So these are coils that are generally within the bore of the scanner itself, or I'm sorry, within the object of the scanner. These send in radio frequency waves. There are coils, surface coils, that you can put on a patient that also can be transmit coils as well, but we generally don't use that for most cardiac imaging. And then the surface coils that we put on a patient, so if any of you have seen a patient go onto an MRI scanner, you'll see that we put coils on their chest, for example. And there's typically coils that are placed anteriorly on the chest, as well as coils that are on the table behind the patient, we call spine coils. These are receiver coils, so they receive the radio frequency wave that's transmitted back. And one of the reasons, obviously, that you try to place these coils on as close to the patient as possible is because you get more signal, right? Because again, the closer you are, it's just like if you think about it, if you have one of those old AM or FM radios, if you get far away from the radio station that's transmitting the signal, your signal is going to get very weak and you're not going to get a very good signal at some point. So the closer you are, the more signal you pick up and the less noise you pick up. And so that's one of the goals, is to try to have receiver coils that are as close to the area of imaging as possible. So one mistake sometimes you'll see a rookie tech may make is, instead of placing the receiver coil on the chest, which is what we want it to be for cardiac imaging, if it's placed a little bit too low and it's placed on the abdomen, then your signal to noise is not going to be as good. So again, these are all the things that you want to look for to make sure that the acquisition is done in the optimal way possible. Okay, so let's go through. So here's an example of, nowadays we have receiver coils that have multiple elements to them, which can essentially cover the entire body almost. So this person has actually a set of multiple coils on. There's a set of coils that goes on the legs, as well as one that goes on the abdomen, and then another coil that goes on their chest. And this allows you to then to be able to do imaging at any specific location that you want. And there's even a coil up here on their head. And these tables now are moving, so you can actually have the table move to the specific area that you're doing your imaging. Okay, so that's a basic hardware. Now hang with me for about the next 15 minutes or so, then we'll get to some of the clinical applications. But I want to just talk a little bit about some of the basic physics behind MR. So one of the things you'll oftentimes hear this term called MR spins. And what that refers to is the fact that Protons are normally spinning around, but if they're not inside of a magnetic field, then they're going to be oriented in many different directions. And so this is an example. Here I've got a glass of water, and there's no magnetic field here. So you can see the protons are spinning around, but they're aligned in many different directions. So as a result, there's zero net magnetization vector. Now what happens is if I place this glass of water inside of a magnetic field, then the protons will align in the direction of the magnetic field. And you'll notice even here, it doesn't mean every single proton aligns in the positive direction. Some may be positive, some may actually be negative. They all align in the direction parallel or anti-parallel to the magnetic field. The number of protons that are aligned positive versus the number that are aligned negative is determined by the strength of the field. So at 1.5 Tesla, there's about 1 to 2 in a million more protons aligned positive than negative. If you go to 3 Tesla, the number of protons that are aligned positive is twice as many. So again, as you go to higher field strengths, you have more protons that are aligned in the positive direction, therefore giving you a higher net magnetization vector. The other thing, and this is just showing you that as well, which is that they can be aligned both in the upright direction or in the opposite direction, so parallel or anti-parallel. And again, the low energy state is parallel. The high energy state would be if they're anti-parallel, but they will align with the magnetic field either positive or negative. I'm going to skip past this here because I already talked about that. The fact that it doesn't mean every single proton is aligned positive, but there's a net positive alignment. And so what happens is when a patient goes into the scanner, then the tissue of the patient's body will gain that same alignment. So if you have a 1.5 Tesla magnetic field scanner, then the tissue that goes into the bore of the scanner will be aligned with the net magnetization vector of 1.5 Tesla. The other thing is that these protons, as we talked about, this is just a natural physical property. They spin around, and that's called precession or precessing. Now there's a predictable speed at which they spin around at. Does anybody know what that predictable speed is? And I know the MRI fellows are on vacation right now, so we can't call on them. But any of the general fellows that have done MRI rotations? Anybody know how? So there's an equation called the Larmor equation, okay? And this is what it is right here, which is basically the speed with which the protons spin around at is equal, which is right here, the precession frequency, is equal to a constant, which is called the Gauss-magnetic ratio, times the magnetic field. So that constant is tissue specific. So for hydrogen, that constant or the Gauss-magnetic ratio is 42. So if you go into a 1.5 Tesla scanner, 42 times 1.5 gives you about 64 megahertz. So at 1.5 Tesla, the protons will be spinning around 64 megahertz. If you go to a 3 Tesla scanner, then 3 Tesla times 42 would equal 128. So they're spinning at about 128 megahertz. So that gives you an idea of the range of frequencies that they're spinning around at. Now, carbon or phosphorus would have a slightly different Gauss-magnetic ratio, and so they would be spinning around at a different speed or different frequency. Okay, so now the next thing I want to touch on is excitation. So you've got these protons that are aligned more in the positive than in the negative direction by a few per million. They're also spinning around at a set frequency, which is based on what the magnetic field is. Now, if you apply a radio frequency wave, then you can cause these protons to pick up that radio frequency wave. They absorb that energy, and it causes them to become excited. And by excitation, what it means is that they actually then will become displaced. So they'll go from being in the upright direction to now shift to going into potentially the horizontal direction. And that's excitation radio frequency pulse that's being applied. And so I'll show you what that would look like. If I applied a radio frequency pulse, not one that causes these protons to be fully excited into the Y or the transverse plane, but rather partially, then they may have just a slight vector shift. So depending upon how much of an excitation pulse you do, you could cause it to be a 20-degree displacement, a 90-degree displacement. You could even cause an excitation pulse which causes a full 180-degree displacement. So you know, depending upon the imaging sequence and what you want to do, you can cause a variable amount of alteration. Now, to get this excitation to occur, it requires, again, depositing energy. So the higher the shift you want to achieve, the more radio frequency energy that will be required. Let me just skip forward here. The other thing I think it's important to keep in mind is that when you cause a net shift, you now have a new vector, which is, let's say, at a 20-degree angle. But you need to think about it conceptually as really two different components. There's a longitudinal component of that vector, which is, again, in your z-axis, and a transverse component of that vector, which, again, is your y-axis, which a combination of those two then give you what your overall vector is. But it's important to keep in mind that there are two different components, and then because there's two different phenomena that are going to be occurring within the longitudinal and the transverse plane, and I'll touch on this in a couple minutes. Okay, so again, if we apply a 90-degree pulse, we take that magnetization vector from being upright in the z-axis all the way to going into the transverse plane in the y-axis. And again, even though you shift it down, it's still going to spin around, right? So that precession concept occurs whether you cause a shift in the magnetization vector or not. And if I apply 90-degree pulse now, this proton is still spinning at the same frequency it was spinning at before, but the difference now is it's spinning in the xy plane as opposed to spinning upright. And obviously, the largest MR signal you get is based on how much magnetization you drive into the transverse plane. Because again, when we receive the signal, what you receive is based on what comes back from the transverse plane. So a 90-degree gives you the maximum transverse vector, and therefore that's what gives you the largest MR signal. So I've got now animation here which shows this, right? So as you apply a 90-degree radio frequency pulse, it causes things to shift down, and then the protons will now spin around in the transverse plane as opposed to spinning upright. The other thing you'll notice here when I show you this is, and think of it almost as if you have a bunch of individuals on a running team. Once you shift them down into the transverse plane and they start running, notice they start separating, right? Because there's going to be some people that are a little faster and some people that are a little slower. And so as a result, the net effect of that, as people start to separate out, is the overall component now that you have in the transverse plane. The vector of that, if you summate all of that together, becomes gradually less and less and less, okay? And that gets to these concept of T1 and T2. So T1 relaxation and T2 decay. So let's talk about T1 relaxation first. And obviously, T1 relaxation is the principle that if you take things out of the low energy state, which again is the upright state, there's going to be a tendency to go back to the upright state. So that longitudinal magnetization will regain itself over time, and that's relaxation. So there's longitudinal relaxation that occurs. And so, for example, after you apply a 90-degree pulse, where initially you have zero longitudinal magnetization, the longitudinal magnetization over time begins to regain itself. Now, the rate at which it regains itself is different for each tissue. Each tissue has a certain rate of relaxation. And this is the T1 relaxation curve right here. Now, most of you probably heard this term T1 time. What is that? Well, this is just by convention. T1 time is the amount of time it takes to regain to 63% of your full magnetization. So you start off with full magnetization, you tip everything down, so you have now zero magnetization. How much time does it take to get back to 63%? That's the T1 time. And again, that's specific for any given tissue. And so, for example, something that has very fast T1 recovery curves would have a very short T1 relaxation time. And what is that? That's fat. Fat is probably the thing that has the fastest T1 recovery. If we look here in the middle, things like myocardium have a little bit slower T1 recovery time, but still a faster recovery curve than something like water. Okay? So again, if we go through and say, okay, what is the time at which, for each of these different tissues, it gets to regain 63% of the magnetization, that's the T1 time. So for fat, the T1 time is very short, on the order of about 240 milliseconds. For myocardium or for infarct, the T1 times are intermediate on the order of 400 to 600 milliseconds. And then for something like water, which has very slow T1 recovery times, the T1 time is on the order of about 2 to 2.5 seconds, so 2,500 milliseconds. So again, this is tissue specific. And so in addition to the T1 recovery, as I talked about, there's also the second component, which I talked about, which is once everything is driven into the transverse plane, it gradually begins, the signal begins to dissipate, right? And again, just like you have all the runners that are running around, if you look at the net vector over time, they start to spread out from each other. Some are a little further, some are a little bit further behind, some are a little further ahead. And so this is really the T2 relaxation, or T2 decay. And so I'm going to, I'm going to go back to this cartoon again, or this animation, and show it. And here we, oops, sorry, let's see if this, is it playing? Oh, there, sorry. It's just a little bit of a pause, I think. There you go. So you see what it's doing here now? As they're spreading out, the net vector is gradually going to become less and less and less, okay? And this next diagram right here shows you that. This shows you what happens in the transverse plane, which is that the overall signal, the overall vector gradually begins to decay over time. And T2 properties also are tissue specific. Certain tissues have short T2 recovery or decay times, and some tissues have very long T2 decay times. And so if you look at water, the rate of T2 decay for water is much, much slower. So and by convention, the T2 time is defined as the amount of time it takes for your decay to go down to 37%. So again, when you tip everything into the transverse plane, you have now 100% magnetization of the transverse plane, gradually begins to decay over time. Once you get to 37% of the full amount, that represents the time at which your T2 time is. And again, if we look at that, we can see that the T2 time for water is very long, on the order of about 1,400 milliseconds, whereas things like myocardium and fat have shorter T2 decay times, and as a result, those are on the order of about 100 milliseconds. Okay, and so it's really these basic principles that allow you to then do imaging which exploits or shows the T1 properties, which is called T1 weighted imaging, or exploits or shows the T2 properties, which is T2 weighted imaging. And so for the same exact patient, the same exact tissue, you can make it look different. You can make it appear different. So on the left-hand side, I've got what's called a T1 weighted acquisition. And here's a big pericardial cyst here, which is composed of a lot of fluid or water. And you can see on T1 weighted imaging, because we said water has very long or very long T1 recovery times, it appears gray. On T2 weighted imaging, that same exact location, that same exact tissue can have very different properties. It appears bright because, again, the T2 time for water is very long, right? So T1 weighted imaging is based on the shorter the T1 time, the higher the signal. T2 weighted imaging is based on the longer the T2 time, the higher the signal. So if I show you an image and say, okay, what is this? The first question you should ask me, well, what kind of acquisition is this? Now, one of the things is after you've been looking at these for a while, just by the way the image contrast looks, you can tell this is a T1 weighted acquisition or a T2 weighted acquisition. But when you're starting out, you really want to look at what are the parameters, and so you want to ask, what sequence is this? Because again, any specific tissue can be made to look different depending upon what specific sequence it is you're using. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the basic hardware that we utilized. We talked about the whole concept of T1 and T2, which again are tissue specific, but you can do imaging to maximize T1 weighted, or you can do imaging to make a T2 weighted acquisition. Let's talk about how you do the imaging itself. And I'm going to go over this quickly because I want to touch on some of the clinical aspects, which I think are going to probably capture people's attention a little bit more. But just bear with me for the next 5 minutes or so. For making an MR image, there's really three components. There's three steps. One is picking the slice that I want to image. So one of the things, if you've ever seen MRI imaging done, it's sitting at a interface, a computer interface, and literally it's moving a mouse or a cursor to say, okay, here's the imaging plane that I want to prescribe, that I want to pick. So the way that the scanner actually picks that imaging plane is, again, now going back to those gradients that we talked about, right? So we said if I have a 1.5 Tesla scanner, I put this patient inside the scanner, then when they first go inside, the magnetization for this patient now is 1.5 Tesla. But what I can do is I can then apply a gradient which causes a slight alteration to the magnetic field, such that at the very center, which let's say I center it for the patient's heart, to one direction, the magnetic field will be slightly higher than 1.5 Tesla. So maybe 1.51, 1.52, 1.53 as I go further away towards the head. And in the opposite side, towards the feet, the net magnetization will be slightly lower. So 1.49, 1.48, 1.47. Now, once I've done that, now remember when I apply my radio frequency waves, only the frequency that I apply will get picked up by protons. So only the protons that are spinning at the frequency I transmit an impulse to. So as a result, by this approach, you can actually specify, hey, I want to image a slice that's right here in the very center. I want to image a slice a little bit higher up or a little bit lower down. You specify the slice. The scanner does all the calculations for you and says, okay, for this gradient that I'm applying, I need to apply not 64 megahertz, but maybe 64.1 megahertz to excite a slice that's a little bit more towards the head. Or 63.8 megahertz to excite a slice that's a little bit more towards the feet. And that's the way that it prescribes. And when you send in those radio frequency waves at that preset frequency, only the slice of interest gets excited. Once you have only the slice of interest that's getting excited, now everything else that happens will only happen to that particular slice. And that's where then there's these two other gradients that are applied, the phase encode gradient and the frequency encode gradient. And I'm not going to get into all the extensive details about this, but essentially the frequency encode gradient is a separate gradient that's applied in a different direction, which causes the protons to then have a slight alteration in the frequency that they spin at. And that's the signal that comes back to you, which will come back to you with a range of frequencies, and that allows you to localize things within this particular slice. And then there's the other component, which is the phase encode gradient, which are a series of steps that we do where we alter the gradient slightly in a third axis, which causes slight variations in the amount of a net phase shift. And again, the idea behind this here is if you have a bunch of runners or cars at the Indy 500, they're all running around together. Well, as they start to separate from each other, you'll start to see that there'll be a net shift of one car from another car. And from that, you can figure out where something is located or what the speed with which something is going at. Okay, so those are kind of the basic components. One other thing that's important, when we do imaging, we're not imaging the top of the heart or the bottom of the heart. You're collecting information about frequency and phase. Okay, so these radio waves that come back and forth. Now, the way that an actual image is generated is you take this information about frequency and phase, which we refer to it as K-space, and then apply a transformation to that, which is called a Fourier transformation. So this is a mathematical transformation that applies that will then generate the image itself. Now there's two important principles to keep in mind. One is that every line of K-space somehow contributes to the image. So it's not like, again, that you're imaging the top quarter of the heart or the bottom quarter. Anytime you sample any information, all the information will somehow contribute to the image. So in fact, on the left-hand side, I've got the full K-space cadre of phase and frequency information. I can actually reconstruct an image just with the very center lines. And if I just did the center lines, I still get a full image. It's not like I just get the center of the image, but there's a difference in the image characteristics. And the difference here is that this image right here gives you information about image contrast, but not fine details, right? So the center lines, you notice I have bright versus dark areas, but notice the edges are not very sharp. On the other side, the peripheral lines of K-space are what provide information about image detail, but they don't give you any information about image contrast, okay? So the point is, you could sample just half of K-space and you generate a full image. You could sample just a very center of K-space and you get a full image, but the image will be altered in one way or another. All right, and that's actually, understanding that principle, I think, is one that's probably the hardest, or it's conceptually different than a lot of the other imaging techniques that we do. If you understand that, that will help you understand how, if there is an artifact, how it's not going to be a case where you're going to see a misregistration or a step. What you're going to see is either blurring or alteration in signal intensities. So in this example right here, if I showed you this image, there's a problem. Something's wrong in this acquisition, right? We all agree with that? It doesn't look good. What's the problem, though? Right? Can anybody tell me what the problem is with this image here? What was that? Say it out loud. Okay, so there's motion, right? Because it's blurring. And in this case, actually, is the blurring just within the heart, or is it blurring in the entire image, the heart and the abdominal structures? What do you guys think? Both, right? Because if you look at the abdominal structures also, they look blurry as well. The borders are not well defined. So this is a case where the person was not holding their breath. So your lines of data are not perfectly lined up with each other because, again, the actual object you're imaging is moving during part of your acquisition. And as a result, it leads to blurring of the image. It's not that you see the heart moving, right? Or it's not that you see the diaphragm moving up and down as you would if you were, with a lot of other imaging techniques. Here, again, all the lines of data that you acquire somehow go to the image, but they cause some corruption to the image. Okay, so ultimately, again, if you know how to use all of these techniques, you know how to make sure you work around the cardiac rhythm and the respiratory cycle, you can then get a variety of different types of images. Now, why is this important to know? I think this is important not just if you're going into imaging or if you're going to MRI, but the reality is this is a publication in a radiology journal a few years ago showing, in fact, that the utilization of advanced imaging is continuing to rise. Over the last decade, it's risen substantially. So whether you're a cardiology fellow or whether you're even going into internal medicine, you need to understand how these advanced imaging techniques work, because the reality is they're going to be part of your practice, as you move forward. A couple other things, though, I do want to touch on, and one is this right here: safety. Okay. Remember, it's a very strong magnetic field. The other thing is, if you go down to the scanner on a Sunday night, all the lights are out, the computer console is turned off. Is the scanner off? Is the magnet gone? Is the magnetic strength gone? No. So magnet's never turned off, okay? Because to turn off the magnet is a huge ordeal, all right? Because then to turn it back on, it would be like $50,000 to ramp it back up. So that magnetic field is always there, right? Whether lights are out, whether anybody's in the room or not. So one of the things is you never want to go into that room with any metallic objects, or at least you want to know about what you're going into the room with. Okay, this is a case where somebody took a bed in, and you can see what happened. Because part of the problem is, as any metallic object gets closer to the magnet, the strength of the pull gets faster. So it actually becomes a projectile. So if you even take, a paper clip into the room, there's a possibility that paper clip could actually become a projectile, and there's cases where people have gotten hurt. So again, the first thing is, do not go into that room unless you've checked yourself out to make sure you don't have any metallic objects, which are what we call ferromagnetic, which means they get pulled to the magnetic field. And in fact, that's why there's a nomenclature for zones of safety. And you'll notice, if any of you have ever tried to go to a MRI facility, is you got to keep getting your badge out over and over again. Basically, at multiple zones, there's controlled access. And the reason for that is because you don't want to have a complication occur. And so this is what's called this is the ACR, the American College of Radiology safety zone nomenclature. And it really goes from zone 1 to zone 4. Okay, so zone 1 is really the area outside of the MRI suite. Okay, so before you go into the MRI suite at all. So obviously, you can walk around zone 1 however you want. You don't need to worry. Zone 4, on the other hand, is right here. That's the actual MRI room itself. Okay, so obviously that's where you're going to have the greatest magnetic field. And then within zone 4, within the MRI room itself, you'll see oftentimes there'll be a line demarcated, a circular line around the scanner, which is called a 5 Gauss line. That's considered kind of the safety line, which you don't want to have any ferromagnetic objects go within that 5 Gauss line, because then there's a risk they could become a projectile. So it doesn't mean that you can't take any metal objects into the MRI room, but you got to know what you're doing. You got to see what the object is, how ferromagnetic it is, and then make sure you stay outside of a certain line, which is considered kind of a safety line. Zone 2 and 3 then, so zone 3 would be basically the control room. So this is where the MRI technologist would sit. This is where we actually sit and do the imaging. So we're sitting in here controlling the computer that runs the scanner. That's zone 3. So this also is a controlled access area. So zone 4, you can't go into that zone unless you push a button or wave a badge. Zone 3 also is badge controlled access. So, and that door needs to remain closed at all times. So zone 4 and zone 3, those doors should remain closed at all times. If any of you get called down for a code, they say, oh, we got a patient who's crashing, who's in cardiac arrest, you do not go rushing into zone 4. You don't go rushing into the scanner room. Instead, you tell the MRI team to say, please bring the patient out. And they bring the patient out to zone 2. That's where then you can do your resuscitation efforts, okay? So one of the common mistakes is people go rushing in, they've got stethoscopes, they've got pens, and who knows what else. And if they go into the MRI scanner room to save the patient, not only will you have done more damage to the patient, you're going to be in trouble as well. So please don't do that. And then zone 2 obviously is the area that's the first access to the MRI suite. There's controlled access to get into zone 2, but that's the area essentially where you've got people that are unscreened can be in zone 2, as well as obviously the people that are doing the screening. So what we generally do is a patient comes in, they check into the MRI suite, they come into zone 2, this is where the nurses and the techs meet with them, go through and do a metal screening process to find out if they have any metal. And again, it doesn't mean that any metal means you can't do an MRI. It just means you need to know what it is that they've got, and you need to have a way by which you work around the metal that they have. This is the next concept, which again is the idea that there's different, for any object that you're thinking about taking to the MRI scanner, there's a nomenclature that's defined for what it's called. And that nomenclature, so it used to be, the FDA used to call it MRI safe or unsafe. We've moved away from that nomenclature, and I'll explain to you why in a second. We moved to a nomenclature of MRI unsafe, which is something that is clearly a hazard in the MRI scanner. MRI safe, which is something that is going to pose no hazard at all. So that would be something like a plastic petri dish, which there's no way, it's not going to pose any hazard to a magnetic environment. And then most of the other stuff falls into this category of MRI conditional. And what that means is that there's no known hazard under a pre-specified set of conditions and pre-specified environment. And that's where, if you look at now, most of the devices that we do today, the implanted devices, most of them, they don't have a labeling of MRI safe. They're labeled as MRI conditional, which means in a certain set of conditions, there can be acceptable risk to do these. What is it that you worry about with devices when they go into the MRI scanner? And there's really several different things. Some are theoretical, some are real. I think that the 3 main things you're worrying about is one, heating. So one is because if you take a metal into the MRI, when you start to play the MRI scanner, remember you're sending in radio frequency waves back and forth. Those radio frequency waves could also be absorbed by the metal, and that can cause heating. So that's one thing you need to be concerned about. The mechanical effect, which is, could this metal actually get moved by going into the MRI scan environment? That's another thing you want to be concerned about. And then the third thing is this electromagnetic effect. And there's several things here. One is, if you have a pacemaker or defibrillator, it will no longer be able to correctly elicit what the patient's rhythm is, right? Because the way that a pacemaker or defibrillator works is constantly looking for the patient's rhythm, and it's saying, okay, a pacemaker says, okay, if I don't see any R waves for a period of time, then I'm going to fire an R wave or fire a pacing spike. The problem is when you're in the MRI environment and you have MRI pulses playing, the devices can get fooled into thinking the MRI activity is actually the patient's intrinsic rhythm. It has no way to be able to distinguish that. And so that's why you need to know that a patient has a device, and then we'll reprogram the device in a specific way to get around this. And these are just a couple of publications that came out in the literature within the last 5 years or so. One which we were involved with, a multi-center study, and then another one which is a single center study from Hopkins. And these really kind of said that yes, MRI, pacemakers or defibrillators that are not labeled as MRI conditional could potentially be done if you have a preset screening as well as a preset programming approach. And that now has kind of made it to the guidelines as well, or the consensus documents, which really say that nowadays, I think many of the devices, even the old generation devices, can be safely scanned if you're careful with the way that you do the acquisition. And I'm going to touch on this here. I don't know if you can hear this or not. Let me see.
Thinking of taking a road trip to Vegas, be warned. The new MGM.
Can you guys hear this?
There called the Vidara has.
Can you guys hear that or not? Okay, let me. I'm going to turn the volume up here.
Thinking of taking a road trip to Vegas, be warned. The new MGM hotel there called the Vidara has been found to contain an extra you definitely don't want. It turns out when the sun's rays hit that curved building, it creates a 15-foot wide hotspot on the ground that is so brutal it can burn hair and skin and even melt plastic. Some unlucky hotel guests have been sent running from the pool area after being caught in what hotel employees are calling the death ray, a burning sensation from above. The hotel is rushing to fix the problem.
Okay, so let me tell you the story here. It's kind of an interesting story. So how many of you have been to Vegas on a trip, vacation? Half of you? Okay, so this was a new hotel that came out about 10, 12 years ago. Obviously, these are multi-billion-dollar projects, so they have extensive architects that plan everything out. Well, what happened was, you can see it's a lot of glass, right? And it's curved. Well, there's maybe about a few days, 3 or 4 days in the year, which during a couple of hours during the day, the light, if it's a sunny day, the light all gets concentrated down into one 4 by 4 foot area of the pool. All of a sudden it heats the pool and it actually caused burns to some people that were there. The point of this is that's why we don't use the term MRI safe any longer in very rare cases. And this really applies to anything, right? It's not just MRI. It's that in a certain set of conditions that we've tested out or that we've modeled, we can say, hey, it looks unlikely that there's going to be a complication, but you can't predict every possible scenario. And there can be low frequency, unusual combination of events that can occur. And so I think what I always tell our MRI team is that anytime if you're scanning patients with devices, you always have to be aware of that we have a certain set of parameters that we've tested out, but doesn't mean you can possibly test out every possible scenario. And in fact, the way that now most devices get MRI labeling is less about actually doing experiments and more about doing computer modeling, right? So they model a variety of different scenarios. Well, what if the pacemaker is, 10 centimeters? What if it's 20 centimeters? What if it's 15 centimeters above? What if it's to the left? What if it's to the right? What if you apply an MRI scan sequence that looks like this? What if you apply a slight different scan sequence? So there's a variety of different ways that this can be done. And so I think the main kind of point of this is that you always need to be vigilant if you're scanning a patient with any device to be on the lookout for any potential complications that can occur, even in devices that are labeled as, quote, MRI conditional, FDA approved. Last thing is, if you look, there's a website you could go to, or for any of the new devices that come out, they all have to get some kind of FDA evaluation done for MRI safety. Most of them do. And so on the labeling itself, so any new stents, any new TAVR valves, any new pacemakers, defibrillators will have a specific section in the package insert which talks about the labeling. And it may say something like it's MRI conditional at any field strength. It may say MRI conditional at 1.5 Tesla. Maybe it's 1.5 and 3 Tesla. It may vary depending upon the particular device, but these are the scenarios that they've modeled and found that it's considered to be acceptable risk. And obviously your goal should be to try to scan those patients in those acceptable set of criteria. Okay, so let me wrap up here in the last couple of minutes with another important thing for cardiac imaging, which is gadolinium contrast. Okay, so I think we talked last week or the week before about the echo-based contrast agents that we utilize. So for MR imaging also, there's a specific contrast agent or set of contrast agents that we utilize. They're called gadolinium-based contrast agents. And so gadolinium is an inert metal, which actually can be very toxic if you're exposed to it directly. And as a result, it's chelated to something. Okay? So all the gadolinium agents that we utilize have a chelate to them that really forms a shell around the gadolinium. But the point of the gadolinium is that it causes actually a alteration in the protons that are in its vicinity, the hydrogen atoms in its vicinity, to cause them to have a faster excitation rate, to essentially have a faster T1 recovery time. And that's a basic principle of gadolinium, is it speeds up T1 recovery of any water-based tissues. And then that's actually the principle that we utilize to do gadolinium-based imaging, like infarct imaging here. You can see this is an example of a patient with an RCA infarction after administration of gadolinium contrast. Now, what are the things that we want to watch for with gadolinium-based agents? So one, obviously, with anything that you administer to a human, the possibility of an acute allergic reaction. Okay? Again, these are low-frequency events, but these are things that you need to be aware of. And this is going to be likely something that they're allergic to that's within the chelate itself. Most of the time, it's a protein that's chelating around the gadolinium. And if the patient is allergic to that, then obviously you don't want to give them gadolinium. The other thing that we want to be aware of is this condition called nephrogenic systemic fibrosis, which, again, really the first reports of this were in the late 90s, early 2000s. We've learned a lot more about it now, and we've also got mitigation strategies as well. And then a third thing, which is this gadolinium deposition, which I don't think we still have a good understanding of whether this is a real phenomenon or not, and what clinical significance there is, if any. So the first thing is this nephrogenic systemic fibrosis. So this is a condition which causes kind of fibrosis of tissue. It can be of skin, it can be of organs. First case report was in 1997. Now remember, gadolinium agents had been around since the 1980s, but this was the first case report. When they initially looked at it, it was mainly in patients with advanced renal disease, so GFR less than 15. But then over the last 15 years or so, there's been a lot of studies that have been done to try to get a better understanding of what leads to this. And the current thinking, again, no one's 100% sure, but the current thinking is that maybe there can be cases where the gadolinium becomes dechelated, right? So it separates away from the agent that it's chelated to. And then as I talked about, gadolinium itself can be very toxic. And so one of the things that's been shown over the last decade or so is really the risk of developing this complication. Obviously, it occurs in patients with renal failure, but that risk is related to the type of contrast agent that you're using, in the sense of, is it something that the chelate is linearly bound to the gadolinium, or is it something where the gadolinium is bound in a macrocyclic fashion where it's completely surrounded like a cage? And so now the recommendation has shifted so that really these group 2 agents, the ones that are macrocyclic, where the gadolinium is completely surrounded, where there's a much lower rate of transmetallation, these are the agents that you really use in clinical practice today. And here the risk of NSF is quite low, such that now it's considered acceptable even in patients with renal failure. If there's an indication to do gadolinium-based imaging, you can go ahead and proceed with doing that. And this was a recent consensus document from the Kidney Foundation and the American College of Radiology, which really said that a lot of those precautions that we used to use, we may not need to be as concerned about that if we're using the newer, lower risk agents. So you don't need to dialyze a patient after giving gadolinium administration. You shouldn't withhold gadolinium if the patient has a clinical indication to get it, even if they have a GFR less than 30, or even if they have acute kidney injury. So, the practice pattern of the field has shifted over the years, and I think this highlights very nicely how, as you learn more, what was that? Is that a clue for me to be done soon here? Okay, there we go. All right. So I think this is what the current consensus is, really, is that if you have a patient who has a good indication for gadolinium-based imaging, use a macrocyclic agents, try to use as low a dose as possible, but you can proceed with imaging. Now, there are some scenarios where we'll still use a non-gadolinium-based contrast agent. This is ferumoxytol, which is, it's great for venous imaging because ferumoxytol is iron. It's an iron-based agent that's actually given for treatment of iron deficiency anemia, but it has magnetic properties, and you can see here it can actually cause opacification of the lumens. And so I've got a case here. One is a gadolinium case, one is a ferumoxytol case. If I didn't tell you which is which, it'd be very hard to tell the difference. So for arterial or venous imaging, we can always use ferumoxytol-based agents. Again, off-label use, but we can still use it. But it doesn't have the extracellular tissue properties that gadolinium-based agents do, so you can't use it for scar or infarct-based imaging. Okay, so, and then I think, again, I gave you kind of a quick overview of some of the basic physics behind MRI, some of the kind of screening and precautions that we take. And then ultimately, I think what we're going to do over the course of this series for the rest of this year and next year is really go through different clinical indications and talk about how you use MRI as well as how you use other imaging modalities, and really how we position one imaging modality and another to ultimately help us best take care of our patients. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and be glad to take any questions from the audience. Okay. Any questions? No? We're good? Okay. All right, thank you all for your attention.